Расцветали яблони и груши, поплыли туманы над рекой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Hi, this is Misha, and in our continuing series looking at Russian guns for this month, we're going to look at the probably most famous Russian gun, the Mosin-Nagant model 1891 series. Now, to be clear, in Russia, these rifles are not referred to as Mosin-Nagants. In an official military service, they were just called the model 1891 infantry rifle, is the one I'm holding here. And sometimes I saw over there Mosin rifle, or Mosin, as some Americans like to say. But it's a Mosin-Nagant, were the two designers. This all kind of started in the late 19th century. Russia, like many other European nations at the time, was going to a smokeless powder, a modern rifle. This kind of dates back to the 1877, 1878 with the Russo-Turkish War, where Russia was using old Berdan rifles, single shots, and they were being outclassed by more modern Winchesters that Turkey had. So in 1882, it was decided to get Russia a more modern weapon. At first, they thought they could just upgrade the Berdan rifles, but that didn't go anywhere. So in 1889, a competition was held to select a new rifle. There were several entries, but the two we're concerned with were from Sergei Mosin and Leon Nagant. These were the two best, and in 1891 they were pretty much the two finalists. It was a close run thing. Mosin was a captain in the Russian army, so he kind of had the home field advantage. His rifle was simpler, easier to disassemble, but on the other hand, it wasn't as reliable, and it was kind of a cruder design. Nagant's rifle was more reliable thanks to what is called an interrupter. It was also more refined and nice. At the same time, it was more complicated and more complex to field strip. So what ended up happening, there was a 14-10 split with the committee who recommended Nagant, but this was overruled by the general staff, and the Mosin rifle was reevaluated, and they incorporated some of Nagant's elements into the Mosin rifle. Now, not a whole lot. Most of this rifle here is the Mosin design, especially the bolt system and all that. But what they really took from the Nagant rifle was part of the magazine, the very good interrupter system, which gave it better reliability, and the stripper clips. Nagant stripper clips proved to be better than Mosin's. So it's basically the feeding system that came from the Nagant rifle. These went into mass production in late 1891 and were in full scale by 1892. They were produced at 3 Russian arsenals, Sestroretsk, Tula, and Izhevsk. They were also produced from 1892 through about 1895 by Châtellerault, or MAC, in France, because at that time Russia was still very much in an agrarian society. They weren't fully industrialized, so their production capacity was quite low in the late 19th century. So what they did is they had France build about 500,000 of these for them while they were getting their production up and running. The first time the Mosin-Nagant, or the M1891, saw some combat was in the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. But the first time major combat several saw use was in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. By that point, nearly 4 million had been produced, so a respectable number. It had been in service for over a decade. The early guns actually lacked an upper handguard. They added this very early in production, around 1894, 1895. Also, the early guns had sling swivels as part of the barrel band here and on the magazine here, and those would eventually be swapped over for stock slots around 1908. Several other changes, and in our blog article I'll actually outline all the little changes. I don't want to bore you in a video, but so it went through some minor alterations during the first 2 decades it was in service. In 1908 they adopted a new Spitzer pointed type bullet, and that's where the modern 7.62 by 54 rimmed M1908 cartridge comes from. The original 1891 was still a smokeless powder cartridge, but it was a round nose. Again, very common trend for much of Europe at the time. Everyone else was going to a Spitzer type around 1905 to 1910 as well. So you're going to see that. By 1910, we have a new pattern of rear sight for the new Spitzer bullet. This one's kind of stiff. And these were the frontline issue weapon for Russia in World War I. Now many of you are familiar with the M9130 Russian, but not everyone knows about the original 1891. So let's start at the muzzle. We have an unprotected front sight, just a blade. We have a 31.5 inch long barrel. We have this upper handguard, which is kind of just held on. The barrel bands are very different. They actually have screws and they just clamp on. It's interesting, you actually turn the opposite direction of what you would think to loosen and tighten them. The screw system is actually kind of neat. We have this rear sight I already showed you. This is measured in arshins, which is the original Russian form of measuring distance. Very close to a meter though. We have a hex receiver, which was standard. Interestingly, some of the prototypes used a round receiver, but by production time they went to this octagonal hex style because it was best used for the vertical and horizontal lays of the time that Tula and Ishevsk had. The bolt is very similar to all later Mosin bolts. It is a little bit different, but that's really neither here nor there for a video. The interrupter is of the Nagant style. It's a 2-piece design. It works pretty well. It has a 5-round box mag with this floor plate. This one's kind of stiff and doesn't like to always go back, so I'm not going to do it. This is an old one. This particular rifle was made in 1915 and went through the war. It was actually gifted to me at Christmas a long time ago by a friend's father. This was back when these were relatively inexpensive, and he bought several basically as parts guns and gave me this one, but it still shoots, still very operable, so I don't really want to get rid of it because it has sentimental value. But yeah, that was pretty much the 1891 Mosin. They produced these in the millions in World War I. It was standard frontline infantry use. They would keep on making it, the long rifle version. Sestroretsk would actually close in 1918, leaving only Tula and Ishevsk to make these after the October Revolution of 1917. And these would actually go out of production in this form in 1926, at least officially. Although finding some made in the 20s is kind of hard. We'll get into why in just a bit. Yeah, this is the original M1891 Mosin-Nagant. Now, during the whole design thing, when they ended up taking some pieces of Nagant's design and putting them into the rifle, Mr. Nagant was not happy and actually threatened to sue. In the end, they ended up giving him 200,000 rubles. Is basically a compensation for his part of his design because they wanted to keep him active in Russia. And that was good they did, because a few years later they adopted his revolver here is the M model 1895 Nagant. Now this revolver, it's fine. It's fine. The cats can walk. The Nagant revolver still fires a 30 caliber bullet, much like the Nagant rifle. 7.62 by 54R for the rifle, and 7.62-38R for the revolver. This is an interesting gun, and we have it in our Makarov video, or excuse me, I think it's in our Tokarev. So I just wanted to bring it out to show yet another Nagant design and how the interplay happened between Russia and Nagant, and why they wanted to keep him in good graces, even though they didn't borrow much from his rifle. But yeah, they ended up adopting his revolver design as well. Well, in World War I, well, I should say World War I itself took a lot of nations by surprise. And Russia was no exception. They didn't have enough guns. They were still modernizing. They were still very much an agrarian society in 1914. So they were looking to get guns anywhere they could. This is one of them. This is a Winchester 1895 lever action, so-called the Russian musket. Now, the 1895 is a very interesting gun. It was designed by John Moses Browning. It was the first lever action the Winchester had that was specifically designed to fire the new smokeless powder cartridge. They tried it for a while. The American military bought a few thousand in 30-40 Craig, but it wasn't terribly successful. They sold about 75,000. Things are kind of petering off. Other models of theirs, like the 1894, were doing better. But when war broke out, Russia was turning to the USA, as did Britain and France, and they wanted Remington to make Mosins for them. And Remington agreed, and you'll see Remington made Mosins as well as New England Westinghouse. And these are just copies of the 1891. But it took Remington and Westinghouse time to set up the production line because they hadn't made them before. On the other hand, Winchester had the production line for the 1895 ready to go. And I said, well, you know, give us the blueprints, give us the specs for the 7.62 by 54R cartridge, and we'll rework our rifle here, our lever action rifle, to fire it. And that's what happened. In late 1914, Russia spoke with Winchester, gave them the specs, and they were going to rework the 1895 for a Russian issue gun. And the first ones were delivered. The first contract, by the way, was for 100,000. The first rifle started to be delivered in June of 1915, and then there was a second contract later that summer, around August or early September, for another 200,000. And this contract would essentially be fulfilled. Russia would receive just shy of all 300,000, call it 290, 295,000, and the ones that were lost were basically just attrition through transport or through rejection, not passing quality control. And all of these would be delivered before the revolution in 1917. So Russia would have over 250,000 of these rifles. Now, I don't know how many, know, and really the 1895 isn't my specialty. I don't do many cowboy guns. But they did some interesting modifications to make this into a military gun. They have a 28-inch barrel. They have this so-called musket-style forearm, which is nearly out to the end, as you can see. We have a bayonet lug here. We have a stacking swivel here. We have a standard front sling swivel here. We have a short upper handguard. We have a rear sight calibrated in Arshins, again for the Russian standard. We have the ability to feed from standard Mosin-Nagant stripper clips. This holds 5 rounds in a single stack mag. We have a carbine style buttstock with a quick detaching rear sling swivel, not unlike the early German rifles like the commission rifle and the early 1898 Mauser. And finally, we have a storage compartment in the buttstock for a cleaning kit. Just slides up. So it's relatively different. These were used en masse. This was a frontline weapon. This was not given to reserves. I've read that many units on the Eastern Front were issued the 1895 Russian musket, and they were lost in tens of thousands. The attrition was very high for this model. Those that did survive through the war and the new Soviet government's treaty with Germany were eventually put into storage and then many given off to Soviet allies such as Spain in the 30s. So even though most 1895s made were actually of this pattern, very few survive, and of those, many of them were sporterized. Of the remaining ones, including this one, this has been refinished. I mean, most of them have had something done to them. A lot of them are sold off as surplus, either the leftovers from the contract here in the 20s by Winchester, just directly to the American public, or they were brought over by an importer such as Inter Arms in the 50s and sold off as cheap sporters and again redone or even rebarreled to different calibers. I've also read that this is a popular rifle in Finland for customizing. They like to put different, these are really easy to rebarrel, so that's probably part of the reason. And it's a strong action for a lever action. But yeah, the Russians definitely had the 1895 in use during World War I, but it really was gone by the time of World War II. But the only place you'll see these used in World War II might have been Finland when they were fighting the Winter War. Well, while we're talking about, if I can do this there we go. While we're talking about guns that Russia used in World War I, this is a Japanese Arisaka Type 38, and once Russia was heavily involved in the war, they were getting weapons from anyone they could, and that included Japan. Once their adversary in 1904, they were on the same side during World War I. Japan was on the side of the Allies. Japan sold Russia a lot, 150, 200,000, maybe even more Arisaka rifles. They were a mixed bag of both the Type 30 and the Type 38, such as this one here. And Russia liked them. They learned to respect the Arisaka during the Russo-Japanese War, along with the 6.5 millimeter cartridge, which is a little less recoiling than the Russian. And actually this would go on to be used in the Russian 1916 Fedorov automatic rifle, which is a story for another day in our SVT video. But I thought I would just pull out an Arisaka to demonstrate one of the weapons that Russia did use. These were more often issued to second line units, where they definitely did see combat in Russian hands. And again, they were very popular with the soldiers who were issued them because of their quality, very simple bolt design. The Type 30 was less popular, but even it was gladly accepted because it was a gun that worked. But yeah, pretty much these are the guns that Russia used. As again, the Mosins were made by Remington and New England Westinghouse for Russia. Something to mention about those, under 500,000 actually made it to Russia, even though over 3 million were initially ordered. And of those under 500,000 that made it, the Russian government actually never paid Remington and Westinghouse for them because of the October Revolution and being in the middle of the war. So it was actually a very large financial burden on the two companies, and the U.S. government had to step in and actually buy what was left over from them. And they were reissued in the American military mostly as training rifles as the model 1916. So there were some Mosin-Nagants, such as this one here, that were officially stamped with the flaming bomb and used for training in guard-type stateside guard duties in America. And basically the American government had to step in and help out Remington and Westinghouse, because if they didn't, they were going to go under. And they produced hundreds of thousands of rifles without payment, not to mention setting up a production line. So there's a lot of history, and again, for more details, check out our blog article. And if you're interested in the Arisaka we just looked at, check out our 3-part series on Japanese small arms. Alright, we'll move on. Well, in 1891, Russia adopted the long rifle version we just looked at. And in 1892, they adopted what they called a Dragoon Rifle. And the Dragoons were a special elite unit in, well, semi-elite at least, in Imperial Russia, that were cavalry that could also fight as foot-bound infantry. So they were basically meant to fight with or without a horse. And the Dragoon Rifle was originally the same as the standard infantry rifle, except instead of having a 51.5-inch barrel, it had a 48.5-inch barrel, and thus was correspondingly about 3 inches shorter. Also, the Dragoon always used the stock slots for the sling swivel mount, or to mount a sling, versus the early style swivels, and it used the later style barrel bands always. So just small things. I guess you could say that when they went to the stock slots, they were actually using the Dragoon style. The Dragoon was issued with a spike bayonet. Now what I'm holding in my hands is not a true Dragoon. This is what many would call an X-Dragoon, which is one that was updated to the 9130 pattern, but it began life as a Dragoon. These were issued and they were manufactured as Dragoons up through about, well, it gets a little tricky, we'll get into it, the 20s at least at Izhevsk, and then later Tula would join in the 20s. So originally they were made during World War I by Izhevsk, and then later Tula would join in the 20s making Dragoons. In 1894, it was joined by the Cossack rifle, which was the exact same rifle, except it was not issued with the bayonet because the Cossack units had sabers. So keep in mind, these are not true carbines. They're barely qualified as short rifles because of the barrel being 28.5 inches. So it's just a little bit shorter, a little bit more manageable. These were used in World War I to great effect. With other Mosins, and they were made after the war, when the Soviets took over. In 1922, it was decided to cancel the Cossack, which really hadn't been in effective production since around 1918, but officially it was canceled in 1922, and the infantry rifle was canceled. The only one kept in production was the Dragoon. Well, in 1924, a committee was established to modernize the Dragoon. And the idea was, we need to modernize it, we need to cheapen up mass production, and adopt a few changes, but let's keep it as easy as possible and not adopt anything that isn't strictly speaking necessary. And that committee went to work. They essentially had everything ready to go pretty quick, but it took until 1930, I think it was around June of that year, for the 9130 to be officially adopted and put into production. So rifles like this one, which are dated 1927, were originally Dragoons, which were updated to the 9130 pattern during a refurbishment. Now, the changes didn't happen all at once. For example, the new pattern of bayonet and front sight didn't come until 1933. The receiver was still left as a hex like this in the early ones until 1936, and so on and so forth. If you want to have a timeline, our blog article will have that, so check that out. But basically just to know that the 9130 didn't come into being all at once. And it was a development of the original Dragoon with this very long, pokey bayonet. And this was issued with the weapon, and it really, it comes off, obviously, but it was meant to be left on the rifle while in the field, so it gives it a very long overall length. The original 1891 used a similar bayonet, except instead of fastening, there's the ceiling. Like I said, it is long. I think everyone who owns one of these has a couple of those holes in their ceiling. This one has a spring-loaded retainer here. The original ones actually had a screw to clamp it down because they just had the open-bladed front sight. So this is a so-called X-Dragoon. Now the 9130 is one of the most well-known surplus rifles in the USA. They've been imported en masse for over 15 years now, and they came in smaller numbers as early as the 50s from places like Finland. They were once incredibly cheap, under $100 for one with the bayonet and all the goodies. Nowadays they're $200 to $300 depending on exactly which one you get. Hex receivers going for more. This is a more standard one. It has the later style round receiver. And the reason they went to this was Tula and Izhevsk obtained new tooling. Originally they were using horizontal and vertical lathe machines, and they got new machines that were more modern and capable. So they went to a round receiver. As I said earlier, some of the prototypes from 1891 actually also had round receivers. So the technology was always there, but it was cheaper and faster in the beginning to do a hex, and it's just how they did it. But they went to the round in 1936. This is an early war example, so it still has the other features of a Dragoon. It has this dished out area on the side of the receiver, here as well for the safety. Here, nice flat spot. Still the same bolt system, pretty much in use. The bolt is slightly updated with the 9130. Also, the interrupter inside of the magazine, that original part borrowed from Nagant, was changed from a two-piece to a one-piece design, which was much more reliable. So by this point, there's very little left of Nagant in the gun. The stripper clips were still of his pattern. That's not really part of the gun, so on and so forth. Still have a 28.5-inch barrel, full-length cleaning rod. Have the updated sights, which are now in meters versus Artians. That was one of the updates of the 9130. And this was what was produced en masse in World War II. Originally, these were slated to be replaced by the Tokarev rifle, which we have a video on too. But when the Germans invaded with Operation Barbarossa, the Mosin-Nagant was put back into heavy production and would remain so until 1944. So the 9130s were produced from, you can either say 1930 through 1944, with some finally made from leftover parts in 1945, or if you want to count the earlier Dragoons which were updated, such as this one, you can say there was kind of a pre-production series starting in 1927. And they would make millions. That one, like I said, was an early war. This one here is a 1942. This is a mid-war, as most professional historians very academically call these. This is an oh shit Germans gun. This was one they made as quick as possible. Now, it was refurbished after the war, as most all Mosins are. This is just one I picked out of an import batch a few years ago because it had a lot of rough machining and was a good example of a mid-war gun. As you can see, this flat area here has lots of marks. There's no longer this dished out area on the side. It's just kind of, I would say, left to be round. This was supposed to be round, but you can see where the lathe, where the tools kind of made it more of an angle shape here. There's a line on top of the receiver here where the tool did its thing. On the flip side, this was also left supposedly in the round, but because they were in such a hurry, it's more of an angled, squared off shape. The bolt handle has been polished during the refurb, but it still is very off-center the way it's done. Not sure if you can see that on camera, but it's just kind of globbed on there. The barrel even has kind of this machined hump in it on the top where it's not quite even. I don't think you can see it on camera maybe, but even this just has really roughly, hastily turned. But in 1942 and 1943, they were cranking these out as quick as they could, no matter what, because they're still a functional, workable rifle. The magazine housing back here is a little cruder machine, just all the metal. The stock on it is probably a replacement added after the war. A lot of these were restocked, but refurbs. But serials do match on this one. Stamped matching. When the 1891 rifle came out, it took about 42 man-hours to make the Mosin-Nagant. In 1942 and 43, with the 9130, they had that down to 13 hours. So their shortcuts and modernizations really cut. I mean, they were able to make more, 3.5 to 1 from the original. So pretty substantial there. This was standard issue in the Soviet era through the late 40s, although it was starting to be phased out as early as 1943. Just a standard infantry rifle that was essentially soldier-proof, cheap to make, very hard to break, still firing the classic 7.62 by 54R rimmed around there, still this old same type of Spitzer bullet. Not much to say. Most of you know the Mosin. That's why I'm not going into a whole lot of detail. And there's a lot of great websites like Mosin-Nagant.net, 76254R.net, and so on and so forth. So they've got excellent articles. But since these were imported in such large numbers, a lot of you have them. For a lot of us, it was our first military surplus rifle, myself included. I bought a couple of guns before it, but this was the first surplus rifle I ever bought. The first one I bought was actually out of Finland because it was in the late, came in the 90s before all the Russian imports hit. You'll see the Russian guns start to come in early 2000s. So since then they've been coming in. Today in late 2016, prices have gone up and imports are coming in slower and slower and in smaller and smaller numbers. The days of the Mosin coming in are slowing down. Here in a couple of years, that'll pretty much be it. I know they made them by the millions, but they also used them. Many were destroyed in combat. Others were given to Soviet allies. And still a lot are still over in Russia where they're used very effectively as hunting rifles. So, you know, made millions, but also millions used. Who knows how many survived? And I don't know how many are in the USA, but they've been importing them in large numbers for 15 years from Russia and from other sources before that. I mean, I think the first ones to come in were import-wise from the 50s from Finland. And we do have a video on the Finnish Mosin. Very interesting guns, and I strongly suggest you check that out if you don't have one. I will warn you, after looking at a Finnish Mosin, you'll probably want to own one because they are really nice. But yeah, I kind of like these mid-war, hastily produced versions of the 189130 just because of the history. You can really feel the haste they were in and the pressure they were under. They would also do the 9130 as a sniper rifle beginning in 1932, and they would start off with a few different styles of scope, but the one that's most commonly encountered is called the PU. It was a 3.5 power scope, first used around 1942, and again made in large numbers. The Soviet Red Army very much believed in sniper or marksman type rifles. Alright, we'll move on. Well, up to this point, you may have noticed we haven't really had a carbine out. And that is because when the original rifle was adopted in 1891, the Imperial generals didn't really see a point to a carbine for some reason. They had the infantry rifle, the Dragoon Rifle, and the Cossack Rifle. Again, the Cossack and Dragoon being the same, except the Cossack didn't have a bayonet. But after the Russo-Japanese War, it was decided, hey, you know, we need something to give the second-line troops as more of a defensive gun. Artillery crews were being thought of, just something they can sling over their shoulder to keep themselves, where they won't, you know, be as heavy and cumbersome. So in 1907, the government, specifically under the Tsar's orders, said that, hey, we need a carbine and we need it now. So they came up with what was called the 1907 carbine. Sometimes these are mistakenly referred to as the 1910, but in reality, it was the 1907. This is not one. This is a later version. I don't have a 1907. They went into production. They were basically a small version of the standard Dragoon type rifle with the slot sling swivels. They had a full stock going all the way out to the front sight, which was the unprotected blade. They did have kind of a unique rear sight. They would be produced at Izhevsk until about 1917, with about 340 to 350,000 made total, and most of those were lost, destroyed, or otherwise during World War I. They remained in service, though, all the way through the 20s and 30s, and that's where this rifle, or carbine I should say, sorry, the M38 or 1938 model came from. Well, they updated the original rifle design with the 9130, but they were still using the old 1907, and eventually it was decided in 1938 that they needed to make a carbine version of the 9130, which is exactly what they did. The M38 is just a shortened 9130. It has a 40-inch barrel. It has the same style of sights, although the rear sight's calibrated. It's smaller than on a rifle. The forearm is shorter. And this cannot take a bayonet. If you notice, the front sight is right at the edge of the barrel. There's not room here to fit a bayonet on it. Ends. further back, it's the exact same thing, round receiver gun, because now you will find some of these built on hex receivers from especially 1944. Speculation there is they took older, damaged 9130s or even just surplus receivers and used them to build carbines. But carbines with all new receivers would have the round. These would be produced at Ishevsk from 1939 through 1945, and they would have a few production runs at Tula in 1940 and 1944. Just to backtrack for a second if I wasn't clear, the original 1907 was just made at Ishevsk. So this was the Mosin-Nagant M38 Carbine, issued to signal corps, artillery, sometimes vehicle drivers, just people needing a second line weapon. This one here was made in 1944 at Ishevsk. It does have an actual M38 stock. It has the somewhat simplified sling escutcheons here, which just has the bottom metal without the side. Otherwise, very standard gun. And I've had this critter, about 15 years. This was one of the first ones they imported when they started bringing in the M38s from Russia. Before that, you could still find them, but they just weren't that common. I like this gun. It's short and pretty light. It's just at about 40 inches long. It weighs about 7.7 pounds. The original 1907 weighed 7.2, so a little lighter, a little less bulky. This one's a little bit heavier just because it's a little overbuilt. Plus you've got the round receiver and the new style of sights, so on and so forth. But it was successful. It was a good little carbine, and it was really the first one that was ever mass produced in Russia. They made about 3 million of these. So compared to 350,000 or less of the 1907, these were mass produced. But this is really the first time a Mosin carbine was. And it was successful enough that it led to one that's probably a little more famous here today. This is the M44. And the M44 is little more than an M38 with a permanently attached side folding spiker bayonet based on the pattern used on the 9130. You just lock it on. But unlike with the 9130, it's a little bit shorter, and it's very easy to take off and just kind of fold back over. Now, because it does have a bayonet, the barrel is a half inch longer, so it's a 40.5 inch barrel. This is 40, meaning the overall length is just a half inch longer. Also, because you have this rather beefy bayonet housing and sleeve up here, this thing weighs about 8.9 pounds. Roughly the same as the 9130 infantry rifle with its bayonet removed. Still a little lighter than the original 1891, but still over a pound heavier than the 38. So you do have some weight, and it's all up front. The stock had to be inletted to take the bayonet. That's how you can tell a 44 stock from a 38. It is worth noting that quite a few 38s, especially ones made in 1945, were put into M38 stocks, because why not? You know, it's the same gun. It doesn't hurt to have that little inlet. This one has the full escutcheons here for the sling, the dog collars for the sling. It also has these little dimples by the barrel band that you see on some Mosins and not on others. Otherwise, same gun. In 1943, they would do kind of a pre-production concept series of 50,000 of these. And then they would be put into standard service in January of 1944. Officially, this was to replace the M9130, and this was the first carbine adopted in Russia intended for general issue, which is kind of distinctive. They liked how the M38 worked. They also, by 1944, had a lot of experience with shorter guns like the PBSH 41 submachine gun, and realized that it was okay to go to a smaller, lighter weapon. Well, not so much lighter in this one's case, but at least smaller. Plus you've got the bayonet here. The reason that was felt so important for a general issue was for urban type warfare, close-in fighting, just to have it in case it was ever needed. Again, these were supposed to replace the 9130, but the war ended in 1945. So, although several were fielded, several tens, 100,000s in World War II, they were never fielded in the millions like the other Mosin variants because they didn't have time. These were produced at Izhevsk from 1944 to 1948. Although after 1945, the numbers were quite small, 150, 250,000 a year, something like that. They were also produced at Tula in 1944 only. I've seen some Tulas that are 1945, but from what I understand, I think they were built using leftover parts. It's also worth noting that in 1944, Tula moved itself back to its original location. For the whole relocating over the Ural Mountains story, check out our SVT 40 video, because it's a very fascinating story, and definitely a tribute to Russian endurance. But yeah, after World War II, this was, for a brief time, standard issue. It was quickly replaced by the SKS, which was quickly replaced by the AK-47, and there was that rapid development of technology. First the SVT, then the SKS, then the AK. So for a long time, guns were being made obsolete nearly as quickly as they came out. That said, this saw a lot of use during the Cold War era. Russia gave these away by the tens of thousands to their allies. They were also produced in Warsaw Pact and friendly nations such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Those three in particular made very pretty, especially Poland, but all three of them made very pretty M44s. Deep, ballooning, nice feeling stocks. This one here was made in 1944 in Russia during the war. Those post-war ones made in the early 50s in East Europe were very well made because they were it was almost like a make-work program. That said, China made it as a Type 53, and those saw real use, both in China and Vietnam. Several of the Russian versions also saw use and issue in the Korean War, 1950-53, that era. So these got around. In fact, some of them are still being used by guerrilla fighters today. They were used throughout South America and all of East Asia, Africa. It was a short, durable gun. Again, like other Mosins, it's soldier-proof, essentially. So that kind of brings us to the end, and how many Mosins were made? No one knows the exact number, but it seems like the consensus is settled out at about 37 million total. At least 17 million of those were the M9130, the most mass-produced variant. I mean, there were quite a few of the original 91s as well. As I said, there was 3 million of the 38s, and there were several million of the M44s. So, very large number. And that's why so many are still around today, used as hunting and sporting guns in many nations. Still in military use, not necessarily with standing militaries, but guerrilla, that kind of military throughout, war-torn parts of the world still. A couple of versions are still even used as a sniper rifle in Russia and other militaries today, based on the 9130. Put a scope on them, it's still a very reliable bolt action. The 7.62-54R cartridge is still being made in large numbers, and it's powerful. It's on par with 30-06 or 308. So it does the job. It's a gun that goes bang, and it's virtually impervious to environments and climates and how it's treated. Not to say you shouldn't clean these, obviously, especially if you're shooting corrosive ammo, which the surplus ammo is always corrosive. Just assume that. If it's not, no harm, but it is. It's corrosive. So if you do have a Mosin, this is one of your first guns, read up on how to clean corrosive. And no, Windex by of itself is not sufficient. By the way, the only thing in Windex that really helps is water, so just don't worry about Windex. I've always found hot water followed by a rigorous drying out and then regular cleaning has done me well. And I've had Mosins for 20 years now, and that trick seems to work pretty well. Just nice hot water, even if you can get it out of a kettle boiling. Ammonia products also work pretty decently if you're just not anywhere where you can do hot water. But the main thing is just to be diligent. What you don't want to do is leave any kind of corrosive salts, not only in the bore, but also in the chamber, bolt, trigger. I mean, you'd be amazed with some of those corrosive powders and salts blow. But there's a lot out there, and I didn't want to get too boring. I find the 9130 series interesting. It's not my favorite gun in the world, but you know, familiarity kind of breeds, I don't know how to say it, just you kind of see these so much, you take them for granted. But they are very legitimate parts of World War II history. There's no other rifle from that era that I actually saw frontline military service you can still buy for under $300 in what is nearly new condition. All of these were, you find 95, 99% were refurbished after the war. You'll see a little square with a hash mark through it in the receiver and also on the stock, and that's okay. That just means they went through the refurb process in Russia. They threw out any barrels that were just horribly pitted. They mechanically checked them. Usually, most of the time, headspace is good, and most of the time, serial numbers are either stamped matching or at least force matched. So that's nice. I mean, you know, any M1 Grand or M1 Carbine you pick up is going to have also gone through a refurb process in the USA. That's kind of the benefit of the people who won World War II. They got to keep their guns and keep them in storage and refurbish them. You know, the same thing goes for most infields. On the other hand, people, you know, the Japanese guns and German guns are often in original condition just because of what happened. Makes sense. But if you have any questions about the Mosin, do my best to answer them and talk about Mosins, talk about our first guns. I bet a lot of you, this was your first gun too, and I'd be happy to share stories, and it's really neat. This gun here, just to kind of wrap up with a little story, this is before I had an FFL, and I helped a friend out at his gun shop. This is 10, 12 years ago. I called him, hey Jeff, what are M44s going for? They'd been coming into the country a couple of years, and he said, okay, I'll check. I called him back a few days later, hey Jeff, what was that price? He said, oh, I got your rifle here. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, I just went ahead and ordered it. And I said, what did it cost? $50. I mean, and that was with obviously the bayonet, the sling. They were so affordable back then, you could just grab them. But even today, you can still get a nice M44 for $300, $350 on the high end. The M38s tend to go for a little more because they're a little rarer. They didn't make as many, and not as many survive. So I see the M38s going for, say, $350 to $400. And these prices are incredibly relative and will change regional and so on and so forth. Anyway, as always, I really appreciate you tuning in. If you haven't already, please check out our other Russian-themed videos. And this is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.